elves of the subconscious have been kind of, no, we're building the novel right now, you idiot, while you think you're in charge. Like, we are actually constructing it. And
leave us alone.
Leave us, yeah, we'll write the damn thing. Just...
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On? My guest this week is Andrew Pyper, award-winning author of books such as The Demonologist, The Homecoming, and most recently, The Residence. Now, Andrew studied English literature, getting his BA and his MA from McGill University before going on to study law at the University of Toronto. He was called to the bar in 1996, but he never practiced, because instead, he started writing. And he's written some best-selling books, and we're going to talk a bit about that. At the beginning of this conversation, for the first half, we talk about his writing process and the genre of writing and how he's kind of fit into a genre which may or may not always be accurate for what he's trying to do and what he's trying to say through his writing. In the second half, we branch out. We talk about consumerism, Donald Trump, social media, the patchwork quilt of identity, and finally we talk about what Andrew calls the emergence of the stupid. Now, if you like this episode, please get in touch. You can reach out by email or on social media, and you can go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as the notes for this particular show and any other, to find out more about the things that we discussed, maybe the reference to something that you heard in this episode, but didn't quite understand how it fit in or where it was coming from. Also, if you like this show, please give it a rating and a review at Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. You can also do the same thing on Facebook. As always, let me know what on earth you think is going on. Andrew Pyper, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
It's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be here.
It's great to be here in your home.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I just, cut to 5 minutes ago, and I was running around putting the laundry away and making it kind of presentable.
And you work in your home, right?
Yep.
As a writer.
I do.
How do you find that? Is it ever distracting? Do you ever get the impulse to I'm just going to sit on the couch and not work for a while?
That ought to happen, and I've been waiting for it to happen for, the last 25 years, but it really hasn't. I don't know. I don't want to credit myself with, some kind of, exemplary self-discipline or something. Maybe that's it. I'm not sure. But I think I would feel too guilty if I just sort of took myself out to the movies or sort of lay down and had a 2-hour nap or took myself out for lunch. I never do those things.
Yeah. It's a struggle for me sometimes. Like home sometimes for me as a writer can feel like, I just want to relax. This is a space for me to relax, and going out is a place for me to be disciplined. And I don't think of myself as undisciplined. It's just that there's a different zone. And I think that I would be a much better person and better writer if I could find a way to work at home.
Yeah.
And turn this into a more productive space or a part of it, right? But I know it's a conversation a lot of writers have of their working space, but also how that relates to their home.
Yeah, I call people generally who think a lot about their environment, and it could be personal, right? Like there's a lot of I over the years have known people who have ascribed the failure of a relationship or a marriage or just kind of general unease or depression to the city they were living in at the time, right? It could be I had to get out of Pittsburgh. Why is that? It just wasn't right for me. Pittsburgh. I never felt right in Pittsburgh. Or Vancouver, fill in the blank, however you want. And I call those people placists, because they're kind of people who really kind of think about, and I think it's a genuine thing. I'm not saying that they're
totally.
They're not trying to fool anyone, and I'm not one. I've never kind of been a placist in that I've always felt that I could do my work and be happy pretty much anywhere. I'm not that fussy about my environment, so long as it's reasonably safe and my children have a school to go to and there's, available food, I'm good.
It's interesting. There's that quote, wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah.
Right. And I find that if I'm thinking, this is just not healthy for me. Well, what is that saying about me? Is it my reaction to that thing that's not healthy? I mean, obviously, if there's a drive-by shooting every day, maybe we need to leave.
Yeah.
Or if I'm getting asthma because the air is polluted, that might be an issue. But I've heard the same thing from people, and you have to think, well, maybe what's going on is within you. Maybe what's going on is your ability to deal with that. People have written or done their work throughout history in some really crazy circumstances.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes are better. And I don't mean to get too much into the romantic idea, the Hemingway idea of writing, but maybe you're better off for it,
I
for
think
going
so.
through the trial and error of it.
I think discomfort, physical discomfort of some mild degree, is, I think, of great assistance to writers. That I think I remember some years ago visiting a friend who was somewhat older than I was, and they were at a stage in their life when their spouse was retired, and they were de facto retired, and they had a fair amount of money, and so they built this country house, and there was this study that she could look out over this magnificent, fields and hills, and look, there's Georgian Bay in the distance, and it was, this enormous space with a sofa, and I sort of internally thought to myself, very little writing will happen in this room. It's too beautiful. It's too wonderful. I mean, like, why would you write in a room this lovely? So I think, the small window, all the things that you might sort of feel like, you want to complain about as a writer in terms of your environment, it's probably for the best.
I want to ask you the big question, what on earth is going on, but I'm going to postpone it because I've got other questions that relate to this. I really like asking writers about their process, but really specific questions. I don't know if you ever read the Paris Review. Mm-hmm. They do interviews of writers, and they always ask, what do you use, pen or pencil? So, Andrew, what do you use, pen or pencil? Or computer, do you type? What do you do?
I'll answer that question by kind of taking a step, prior to the writing. So that is to say, I'm a big advocate for pre-writing,
like
so
outlining.
Yeah. And so that takes ultimately, a very loosey-goosey form. So various kind of scraps of paper, notes, notebooks, emails to myself, random sort of communications from my own brain back to my own brain, and then from all of that will come the story, however kind of broadly understood, and then I will take 8.5 by 11 sheets of blank paper and staple them together so it forms this kind of long tail, and lay it out on the floor and draw a line down the length of this thing, which would be essentially like a human body length, and break it up into acts and then individual chapters, and within those chapters individual scenes, and it becomes this very detailed thing. And then from there I put it up on the wall of the office. So that's really man-made. That's really kind of, it looks very, sort of like a Dead Sea Scroll or something like that. And then from there, I'm typing on the computer. So the first draft is written entirely, on a word processor or word program. And then it kind of goes back to, the editing will be done with a pen. So I kind of mark up.
Okay, so you print it and then you edit from there, yeah.
Yeah, and read aloud. That's another big, I think when sometimes I teach creative writing here and there sometimes, and people will say, should I get an editor? And I say, yes, if you can afford one, or, hire a freelance editor, get a loved one that you can trust to kind of read your manuscript. Everyone you can get to read it, get them to read it. But if you can't get that, or if you're nervous about that, or you don't have the resources for that, the cheapest and most cheerful way of editing, of course, is reading your own work aloud.
To someone or by yourself?
By yourself.
Yeah.
And you hear, it's amazing. I mean, I did it very recently on a manuscript that was in the very late stages. It was after editing. We're at the copy editing stage. And you'd sort of think, the glaring errors have been captured. No, I read it aloud and it's like, oh, that makes no sense. That's clunky. Why would she do that? Pretty big stuff I caught.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I worked in the theater for about 10 years and was a playwright. I guess I still am. And that was a big trick to learn. Not just reading, with playwriting, not just reading it aloud, but actually trying to get into the heads of the characters and doing voices and all that stuff to have fun with it, but also to show where's the dynamic of this when it's actually read aloud and live.
Yeah.
And not only do you find out simple mistakes with grammar or the way a character speaks, but also the energy and the feel of it. Because when I read something, my voice tells me where the tension often is that my mind may have completely missed, where the tension is built up and released and built up and released, or different elements of structure that I may not have seen before. And it's interesting because writing can be such a quiet, not just silent, but also insular process. We forget that sometimes we need to break it out. And that language is originally an oral form, not written.
Absolutely. And you can capture, again, sort of things that, I'll give an example from just this week. Repetitions that on the page were invisible to me, but in reading aloud, I realized, oh my God, Andrew, you're way overusing the word malice. Malice. And it's not even a favorite word of mine, but in this particular text, it was like malice, malice, malice. So I had to kind of like, replace malice with, malevolence or whatever, I could replace it with or cut it out. But my eyes weren't seeing, the echo of malice, but my ears heard, don't say that word again. It's going to,
Sure.
My brain is going to break. So, yeah, it's an astonishing, and again, I think what's wonderful about it is that it's free. You just need 3 hours and just do it. You feel a bit foolish at first, kind of like, am I going to do this alone? But it's enormously helpful.
When you were mentioning earlier in the writing process, that first stage of sending emails to yourself and just taking notes and talking to yourself about an idea, is that a disciplined process? Is that something you can do, wake up in the morning and do it, or is it kind of in the back of your mind while you're in the shower process?
Very much the latter for me, anyway. So that no, I'll refine that by saying it's a bit of both. There's a certain kind of practical driving forward impulse to sort of, okay, must write book, have general idea of what the world of the book is going to be. Let's get to it, shall we? This time waits for no one. And then but it kind of bumps up against, well, what is the story or what is it about? I mean, it's just not enough. It's a little bit like, the cab driver story of like, hey, what do you do? I'm a writer. Oh, I've got an idea for a story. Oh, really? What is it? And then they'll say something like, well, it's about a guy who robs a bank, and then I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So it's not actually, you don't actually have an idea for a story. You think you do, but the moment you try to articulate it, it kind of runs away like a mouse out of the kitchen. So that's the forward thinking part. But it's the subconscious, in the shower, letting things kind of rattle around, and you collect them. I end up kind of collecting them quite literally in notes, kind of like and I keep them in plastic bags, and it looks like, at tax time when you kind of spill all the receipts onto the dining room table. That's what I do, and it's this kind of ugly process of going through the last year of your life and all the ways you misspent money. In this case, it's all the notes of like, just kind of random, like could be descriptions of like how a person walks or a bit of dialogue you heard on the subway. And what's remarkable is that 80% of that stuff weirdly relates to the story at hand. It's almost as though some other crew, some kind of elves of the subconscious have been kind of, no, we're building the novel right now, you idiot, while you think you're in charge. Like, we are actually constructing it. And
leave us alone.
We'll write the damn thing. And it's amazing how much of that work can be done while from the outside it looks like you're not, quote, writing at all.
How long does that take, that part of the process?
More and more, as a matter of percentage of people will ask, how long does it take to write a book?
Yeah.
And my answer to that is kind of like, well, what stage do you mean? So the writing of a first draft from book to book to book has gotten, as a percentage, much less.
Yeah, your time in between books is getting shorter and shorter.
Yes. Partly that's a kind of practical matter of like, get to work. Part of it is learning how not to waste time or avoiding the ways that I used to waste time. And one of them has been sort of thinking that the first draft is where you luxuriate, and isn't that writing? Writing is the forming of sentences, and then the creation of 90,000 words, and the declaring of a novel. And I've come to realize that that's really a smaller part of it, and that a larger part of it ought to be the thought that goes into it prior to, the typing.
Yeah, I was looking at the listing of all your books, and that used to be like Arcade Fire. Every 3 years you had a book. or Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright, who was just like clockwork. He had a process. Every 2 years he'd write a play, or it was 2 or 3, and like he had it down to a science by the end of his life. But you're getting quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
Now you're in 1 year, you've got 2 books. Well, in 2 books in 2 years, really. And I guess it's partly because your process has been sharpened and refined, and you're learning to waste less time. But it's interesting because that idea of what the premise or the idea of the book is. You had a conversation on the This Is Horror podcast. 4 or 5 years ago, and talked about sharing an idea, something that many writers are very afraid to do in the early stages. But maybe it was iconoclastic or just actually true that how is an idea unless it is shared? How is this anything worth anything unless it's discussed and pulled apart and seen if it's the right thesis? But do you find that idea changes in the process, like that you think you've got it, you discussed it, maybe shared it, but then in the process of sending the notes to yourself and then outlining, it's actually something different, that thesis has changed?
Yes, and this is where I get kind of nerdily excited about outlining, because I think people hear the word outline or the process, or imagine the process of outlining, and think it's some kind of predetermined, unfun, labor, when in fact it's the most explosively creative part of the whole process. And part of it is precisely as you've just asked, that what happens is you think, okay, this is just a practical matter of forming the story. It's engineering, but I need to do it. It's structure, right? And when in fact what's happening is these questions are being asked of what really is the story. And I sort of think of it as a sort of the about, finding the about of your story. So you go in thinking, I know what this story is about. It's about a guy who does this, and ends up here. And what happens in the process of outlining, which is really an interrogation of the concept, is that about is in fact something else. It's the premise on the surface, but what you're really searching for and what you discover in the process of outlining is that thing beneath the surface that the book is truly about. And I think that's why a lot of books or manuscripts that, quote, fail, is not that they're written by, unskilled writers, nor is it a bad concept. It's just the about of the story was never discovered.
Well, and in a way, when you say you're interrogating that concept, insofar as you're doing that, you're interrogating yourself, because you're asking yourself, well, what did I hear on the subway today? How might that influence what I'm talking about? And you may, we're multifaceted. You may be 7 different ideas floating around the world, but sometimes a good book is 7 different things pulled together in one unified field theory, so to speak. And, rarely is a book about one thing. A book is about, like Mahler said about writing a symphony. A symphony is about the whole world. Often a book can encompass a whole world because it's about real people. Mm-hmm. If it's only about one thing, then those characters aren't characters anymore, as they are caricatures, I guess. It's an interesting process because at one time it's expansive and you're building and you're trying to encompass more and more, but you're also laser focusing in on one thought and making sure by interrogating it that it holds up.
Yeah.
And I think that in your books that each one of them can be described in terms of its premise very well, but they also cannot be encapsulated in a single sentence, because there's not just the twists and turns of a book, but they're about so much more than that one thing. But the premise is clear, right? And it's a very interesting thing, and I think that makes it, and we can talk about genre later, but it makes it easy for someone to say that you're a mystery writer or a horror writer, because they can say, well, this is the premise of these 7 books, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. And that can be, if viewed from some kind of career helicopter, it's like, is that a good thing? Mm-hmm. Or is that kind of, it can be inconvenient.
Yeah, that was a question I had for you,
yeah.
is genre. And because I don't find in reading your books that you're a genre writer, but you are in marketing turned into a genre writer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's been a career-long question for me, and it's been asked not by me, but typically, sort of the people publishing the books or the people buying the books. Sometimes the readers who are disappointed by the books because they felt that they were, looking for one kind of product got sort of they felt, maybe like, that's not the satisfaction that I wanted, and so. And then, having said that, it can also split the other way, that people are quite, delighted by oh, I got my scares, and I got my disembodied corpse in the first act, but I also got whatever, an insight about family, or
Yeah.
I got something that one would typically associate with, quote, literary fiction or
Well, and
something like
that to
that.
me is something to aspire to. Like that is what I hope for when I open a book, is that it's going to be something I didn't expect and take me somewhere I didn't think I would go.
Yeah.
I would want that. But I guess I'm not a Pulp Fiction reader that's just, putting myself to sleep at night and, looking for something to give me that certain thing to scare me or make me feel happy or give me an ending or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Expectations is a very powerful. I don't know. I would be curious to know whether, let's say, we take readers from 100 years ago. Would they have had that same set of expectations going into a book that contemporary readers do? I don't think so. I think there would be more like, oh, I don't know, here's a new book. Someone said it's good, or I went to the bookshop and this was recommended. Then you just plunge in and you don't know where you're going. Now it's so sort of pre-chewed in from the marketing point of view that I think readers are often, again, quote, they're disappointed because their expectations haven't been met, but the expectations may be unfair or misattributed, and all of this comes down to a publishing industry that is very anxious, and category is a huge driving force in it. Where is it marketed? Where do we put it? How do we market it? I understand all that, so it's not a matter of me saying, "Oh, why don't you just do away with all that?" I don't think
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
simple.
Sure.
I don't know what the solution is. All I can say is that it's a very difficult for me to kind of have those conversations with my publishers sometimes because I don't think that way. I don't read that way. I don't write that way. It's very much like sort of asking, trying to get advice on golf from a hockey player. It's like I can't help you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, and it relates to this podcast because I interview or have conversations with all kinds of people on this podcast. It would be called Catholic if the church didn't already have rule over that word. It's a wide variety of things. I don't know what genre this podcast is. I don't know how I would market it in that respect, what category I would put it in. So I struggle because then people ask and they wonder, well, what kind of podcast is it? I don't know. Well, I'm not going to listen. I'm looking for horror.
Yeah.
I'm looking for storytelling. I'm looking for true crime, whatever. And I wonder, though, because I'm having this conversation, and you clearly have been having this conversation throughout your career, is this not just about books? Is this about a lot of other things? This categorization and this need to know, to pre-chew it and to know what I'm getting into? Because I find that it's also the case with film, with television, with social media, with politics. What party do you prefer? Is a big question that predetermines the kind of conversation you're about to have. If I know that you're a Democrat, Republican in the States or a Liberal, New Democrat, Conservative here in Canada, I know what conversation I should be having with you, rather than, well, why don't we throw up our arms and say, I don't know? And I want to ask you the question, Andrew, just do you think that that's a wider issue? And not what do we do about it, but how do we grapple with this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think you see it in right now is let's say we're living in this moment that we call peak TV, and one of the symptoms or manifestations of peak TV is this enormous explosion of product, and so that's good if you're a TV writer, or if if you've written books that may be optioned for developed for TV. So it's, from a business point of view, it's good for writers, and it's been increasingly hard for writers for certainly my entire career, like probably the last 50 or 60 years, right? So it's good. Let's celebrate for once that writing is being kind of sought after in this aggressive way and not dismissed or just being given lip service. Having said all that, though, it does seem like the result is this really kind of these small pockets and these silos, and the way that our phones are listening to us, and so you kind of I know all of us have the experience of kind of minding our own business, and our phone is telling us, you should eat at this place because I heard you say hamburgers. And so that, I mean, on the one hand, you sort of think, well, what's the harm in that? It's just marketing being made more sophisticated. I think the harm in it is that everyone ends up being these kind of amateur PhDs in their own taste. So this is my thing. I like this. I don't eat that. You hear kids saying that now. It's like, oh, I don't do that. I only do that. And so it's like, well, says who? Like, how could you possibly have formed this extremely sort of monolithic point of view over your 12 years of life? And I think they're getting it from their parents who are saying, like, I don't do that. I only do that. I don't do Chinese. I don't blah, blah, blah. I went down to a couple of years ago with a friend who was pitching a TV show in LA. And I remember I had this joke where I was like, oh, in LA, everyone's just sort of going around talking about what they like. Like, I like it. I don't like it. Do you like it? I hated it. I love it. It was just people sort of pressing a button of, yay or nay on liking stuff, products.
Right.
And the joke's not funny anymore because that's the world now.
Well, and everything's becoming that binary like or don't like on Facebook or like or don't like on Instagram or whatever. It's becoming this simple, is it good or is it bad for you?
Yeah.
And there's also this is something we've talked about on the podcast many times before, but the idea of picking up a newspaper and how that there is something fundamentally different from that, or a magazine, or turning on the TV and having 3 channels. There's something fundamentally different from that to the self-curated social media ecosystem that we live in, because when I open the paper, I don't have 7 other newspapers to choose from. I don't know what I'm going to get. And the only way I'm going to get anything is if I read stuff that I don't know if I'm going to be interested in this. But that's all I've got in front of me. I don't know if I want to watch this program. I wonder if there's a problem about Netflix, for example, not only recommending things to you, but showing you only the things it thinks you'll want to watch. Because eventually, your point of view will become so narrow that the things that you don't think you want to watch, but really should, but really might open your mind to something, might make you think about something, will become fewer and far further between until they're not even there anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's a personal issue for me. I'm worried about living in that state, but I think it also has a sort of a more global challenge. Like, I don't know what that's going to mean for us human beings living in a world where everything is so narrow and so curated to my taste and so based on that binary of do I like or not like, that we're going to become not only insular but disconnected from those who have different tastes. That, in other words, none of us will be Catholic, small c Catholic anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It may be that the cost, and it's just only occurred to me as I was listening to you, say that correctly, in my view, is that the cost may be taste itself. So, in other words, we may just get beyond even the curating to individually idiosyncratic, highly kind of atomized taste, but just, well, what is my taste? I don't even know that anymore. So, because I've been kind of, it'll almost be kind of, the AI of these, kind of taste generating, or initially taste accommodating, will become taste generating.
Right. And this is what some philosophers have said, is that the AI social media ecosystem is turning free will into a system where you don't even have it anymore. That the illusion isn't even there of free will anymore because your choice is already made for you. There was a story about Amazon not too long ago saying that they're going to start a pilot where they're going to send you stuff without you buying it because they're so sure that you want this thing. So let's say, for example, that Amazon has determined that you would really like this lamp in your living room. It knows everything else you have in your living room. It knows generally when you buy stuff. So it's just going to send it to you. Obviously, if you don't want it, you're going to send it back. But they think that the chances of you sending it back are so little that this will make them money by sending you stuff that they know you want or that they know you will feel you need. And now that sounds to some people cool. I don't have to go buy stuff anymore. It'll just send it to me, and I know I'll like it, and I'll know I'll want to buy it. But what does that mean for free will? What does that mean for thinking? What does that mean for sitting on a couch and not knowing what to do and struggling with that indecision? Not just about buying a lamp, not to reduce everything to consumerism, but this whole idea of life being about making tough choices and postponing that decision until we're overcome over an obstacle and there's ramifications to free will, I think, in this, and therefore deep philosophy and philosophical questions.
I agree. You see it in a in a pop cultural way in books, right? Books of the moment, which we've always had and ought to have. So I like that idea of a book, a particular text at a given moment, and everyone kind of reading it and talking about it. There's probably too little of that overall, but my wife, for example, is part of a book club, and so the other people in her book club are similarly aged women, and the books that they choose are almost always books that are like, I could have predicted that they're going to choose this book this month.
Right.
Not just because it's an Oprah pick or something like that. It's just sort of this is the book you will read. And how they receive that message is, I don't know if they know it. I don't know it, but it's like it goes without saying that you will read this book. This is the book. This is the book. And they all get the memo without actually getting the memo. It's fascinating and frightening to me that kind of unanimity of presumed taste has already occurred.
But here's what's interesting is I think that they have their presumed book, but a different book club, say in Texas, has a completely different book.
Yep.
But both groups think that this is the book right now. Or maybe there's 10 groups that think this. But the problem isn't so much that we're divided. The problem, from my point of view, is that we don't know we're divided. We think that this is the book, and the few people over here that aren't reading it don't know what they're talking about. When in fact, I'm one of many. I'm in a multipolar world. But the problem comes in thinking that we're unipolar. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a need, it feels like there's a real hunger for that experience of, I'll give you an example, and I'm sure everyone listening to this would recognize this experience of, getting together with family or dinner party or out with friends. And if you are presumably, sort of 25 plus to 95 and under, you've had that experience of other people saying, oh, what's your show? What are you watching right now?
Yeah.
And then that's followed by, invariably, you haven't seen that? There's this, genuine shock that, Andrew says, because I don't watch very much TV at all. I'll say, I haven't seen that. What? It's like I've said, I don't know, I haven't bathed in 3 months. Like, what is going on with you? And then it's followed by the very strong recommendation, where a recommendation becomes kind of like being thrown against the wall and being threatened. You have to see this. And that urgency, you sort of think, well, Andrew, come on, that's just someone being enthusiastic about something they've watched. I don't think it's that. I think it's a social impulse. It's a little bit like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There's a sort of like, join us. There's just fall asleep and the pod will open up and it'll be great. It feels weird to me. I don't like it.
Is that new? Do you think, or not just new? Is it increasing, or has it always been there? Yeah.
I think it is increasing. I think maybe in the for upper middle class educated white people in North America in the 70s, that thing might have been the latest, John Updike novel or something. Like, oh, have you read the new Updike? Well, there might be that.
Right.
But it's nowhere near the same thing, I think, as we're experiencing now.
Well, and I think that people who are selling things are counting on that intensity. That's what it means to go viral. You've got to watch this video. It used to be, you've got to watch this hilarious 30-second clip of this dog. Maybe not used to be. It still is that. But the intensity is growing, and there's an incentive to that intensity, which is it sells. If someone pushes me up against a door and says, you got to watch this, I might watch it. I've watched television shows and I've read books that are a result of that kind of conversation. And I wasn't necessarily let down, but I haven't until now questioned the fact that that's happening, and that it may be may not just be new, but may also be an interesting feature of our culture that we have to interrogate and wonder why this is happening.
I think it's where that kind of branding, self-branding, is now kind of nudging out of the sphere that used to be occupied by politics. So we used to have maybe a conversation about, what do you think about this issue? What should we do about this? Has been replaced by, for God's sakes, you have to watch Haunting of Hill House or whatever. It's like you have to. It's an appeal that, again, maybe used to be the job of evangelical appeals of one kind or another, or conversions, or political discussion or debate, is now choosing the right shows on Netflix.
Well, and it's almost sinister in the sense that these shows or books or whatever are also sometimes addressing these issues. In other words, if you watch this show about the coronavirus or something like that, then you will be dealing with that. If you read this book about this really important issue, Donald Trump, for example, well, you're dealing with Donald Trump. That's your way of handling that issue. Obviously, we're not handling anything. Knowledge is only the first step, but it's not the whole game. And I think it's making us feel, it's almost tricking our brain into thinking, no, you got that covered. You're good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's an excellent point. Yeah, that you can sort of cover yourself in this blanket, which is a quilt made of patchwork of choices. Again, going back to my sort of L.A. joke, like I like that, I don't like that. This is my favorite. This is the way I like my coffee. That those kind of this sort of collection of choices is now kind of a surrogate self. It's like, who are you? Well, here's my slate of commercial choices.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. That's who you are. And of course, that's not a self at all.
It's what Coca-Cola wants me to say I am, or what this book marketer wants me to say I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting concept because it's actually talking about and questioning this idea of identity, right? I mean, sometimes we chafe at the idea of being asked at a social setting, what do you do for a living? I don't want to talk about what I do. How about who are you and what are you interested in? But the problem is if it becomes the opposite of that, tell me about your interests. Well, just go to my Facebook profile and see all the things all the pages that I like, or all the Instagram accounts that I follow. That's not me. But maybe I'm too old. It's possible that someone who's 18 today would say, no, that is me. This is the world I live in. There are many scholars who are saying that the digital world is increasingly becoming the world in which we live. And that this world here, it's like a simulation, that this world this tactile world may be real and it may be unavoidable, but it's less and less where we spend our time.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, then it's not necessarily that the digital world is bad, but I don't see that as me. But does that mean I'm just less me digital than someone who's 18 today who says, no, this is me. My avatar is who I really am. My online identity is who I truly am and want to be. Whereas this, flawed physical self is who I'm trying to escape from, or who I have to deal with from time to time, like doing your taxes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes me anxious.
Sure.
And it always has, going back to when I was 18, where fandom, all my life, I've kind of, in a way, maybe have been trying to find a thing, a book, an author, a band, a movie that I could not just love, because I love particular books and movies and authors, but love in a way that's like, that's me, that's the thing, that I'm fully invested. I'll have a fist fight if someone says something, against this thing. I've never experienced that. I've almost envied those who do, but I've never been involved in that way. And I think it's not because I, lack passion. I think it's because I'm just really suspicious of the decision to be invested in that way.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like, it's like that becomes, I guess, this self. And I sort of feel like, well, no, I don't know what myself is, but it's not that. It's not a sort of an affiliation with, taste.
Something that Andrew mentioned in this conversation so far, which has ramifications for the rest of this episode, is the idea of something that is taste accommodating versus something that is taste generating. We are talking about taste in terms of preference, in terms of what you like and what you don't like. And that has meaning not just for Andrew's books, but for the social media environment in which we live, in fact, the world in which we live today. Now, coming up on this episode, I do in fact ask the question, what on earth is going on? And one thing that Andrew brings up in response to that is this idea of the stupid, the growth of the stupid, and that we're no longer having a left versus right debate, but perhaps a smart versus stupid debate. It's a really interesting idea, and it's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. I remember being asked when I was younger, who are your role models? And I was never able to answer that question. Similar to you, there was a certain suspicion that came with it, like role models. Why? I mean, sure, there are people that I've learned from. There are people that I respect deeply and that would read anything they put out, or would listen to whatever lecture they would give, or would try to go see them if they came to town. But role model, I don't know if I would put it in that way. It doesn't mean I'm dispassionate, but I think that there's a disconnect there. But you're right, because people who have a clear answer to that question, it's almost like, I know where I'm going, I know what I'm doing, and I'm not afraid of it.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can be, locked away because of our suspicions and extra caution. And it's an interesting idea.
You get it. One sees it in the writing world, which is ostensibly my world, you see it there too. And I have the same response to it. That is, so I have some colleagues who are really, they find it very important to feel that they're part of a community. And obviously, community is a very amorphous term. It can mean all sorts of things. But in relation to the writing world, I think some writers will feel like, well, no, this is my writing community. That could be the national Canadian writing community. They just sort of feel that. It could be a province, a town. It could be something much smaller. It could be connected to their personal identity or politics in some way. However, it's fractured. They feel a priority of finding affiliation. It could be institutional, right? There's increasingly back in my day, says the old guy. But there weren't really MFA programs to speak of. I don't remember it being remotely an option anyway, if there were. Now, of course, we have programs like UBC, which are giant faculties pumping out lots and lots of professionally trained writers and faculty and people feel affiliations with an institution like UBC or wherever whatever institution you might sort of feel. And I sort of, I've always been very wary of that. I've never had a mentor. I've never studied creative writing in any formal setting. And I don't mention these things by way of sort of like, because that's how awesome I am.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I think it's just always been a reflex to, and I enjoy community too. I have a lot of my best friends are writers. I enjoy the company of writers. I love talking about writing and complaining and griping and drinking with my friends who are writers. So it's not that I'm kind of a lone wolf in any respect, but I'm hesitant when it starts to be understood as a community, because then it feels like, going back to what we were saying earlier, it's sort of like, who are you? Well, this is my affiliation. I kind of, I want to rip that hello, my name is tag off.
Yeah, and get rid of the label. Because there's also this question that's underpinning that, which is, what is the role of the writer? What is the role for you, Andrew, as a writer, but what is the role of the writer in society? And oftentimes it's subversive. It's not just content creation, which is a phrase that is replacing writer in many circumstances of employment. I'm not a writer, I'm a content creator. Because you don't just write, I suppose, you also create outlines or maybe images or something like that. But it doesn't sound right to me, because that seems like a very business model machine that is producing something, as opposed to someone who is asked and tasked with thinking about something and coming back to us. Go off and think about this and come back to us and let us know how it goes. That's different from someone who's told, we need this by 5 o'clock today to make our target. And that, the content creator has a clear community. The writer may not. The writer may have to subvert the community. And I think we have to ask the question both individually but also collectively of what this role is, if there is one.
Yes, and it's all of those points are true, and all of them make the work of trying to make a living as a writer of fiction specifically, all the harder, because I think good writers do precisely that, right? They kind of not reinvent the genre every time, but they do something that kind of pushes against the pre-existing, and that frustrates marketers, because marketing is all about like, well, tell me exactly what this book is like that has already worked, and when the answer is no, I'm intentionally trying my best not to do that.
Yeah.
It frustrates them. It frustrates everybody. And yet that is precisely our task. And then it makes, will this book be successful? Who knows, right? That has always been the case. Who knows? But when on the occasions when I've written a book where I have felt kind of the most proud of it as that achieved kind of what I set out to do, is precisely the same moment that I realize I have no idea how this is going to do in sort of, in a readership or in a marketplace. I'm really insecure. So I'm at my happiest or doing my job best when I'm least secure.
And how did they do? The ones you felt the most proud of, how did they do compared to the ones less so?
Has no predictive value.
Right. Okay. There's no correlation there.
No. Because some of the books, again, sort of, I guess where success is measured by, there's different ways to measure it, I guess, but, sort of sales, or generally people being like, I like that one. I recommended that one. They're sometimes the books that I would sort of feel like, well, that came the easiest, maybe almost sort of suspiciously, slightly too easy, or I could have, I wish, maybe have sort of slight regret about, or wish I could go back, then been very, very successful. And other times books where I've, again, sort of felt like nailed it have been, people are like, yeah, not with me.
It's interesting. Like when I was in high school and university, my barometer, my way of understanding how I did on a test before I got the result was how I felt about it. And if I felt good, I did poorly. If I felt
Yeah.
if I felt really bad, I knew I did well. And there's maybe something more to that, which is that the additional stress of like, oh, I'm not doing well at this may push us over the edge a little bit and have us do better with our work. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily a corollary here between my high school career and writing novels. But I wanted to ask you, Andrew, and you may have already answered this, but maybe we can refine it kind of like that, what we were talking about earlier with the concept of a book. I have to ask you the first question, which I never asked, which is what on earth is going on, which is a broad question. And we've been talking about this. We've been answering it, but I have to put it there because I don't like getting through an episode without asking it. Andrew, what on earth is going on?
Well, I anticipated this question, and I think and my answer is kind of still kind of fuzzy, but I'll tell you what's been on my mind about the world recently, which is the deployment of stupidity, or the stupid among us. There's no other. I mean, that sounds like a put down, which obviously it is, but I can't think of an alternative term for it.
Yeah.
So we'll just call it the stupid. The stupid as a constituency, as a political force, as a block that can be deployed and used to further the goals of those who are just not quite as stupid, or at least are smart enough to recognize how to use the stupid.
Or are good at pretending that they're stupid.
Or good at pretending that they're stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how prior to this insight, if that's what it is, I sort of thought that, let's say, politics was still fundamentally ideological. That that we have debates about. One might feel as a conservative, I don't want things to change, and as a progressive, I do, and that those were their clashes, and they would one side would win at a particular moment, and others, and that still feels like on the surface the theater that is being enacted in this political sphere. But I'm starting to wonder whether, with the advent of social media and its abuses, with the current president of the United States, with the sort of regressive, grinding, frustrating beliefs that seem to be kind of popping up in quarters where you think, surely we've stomped that out. These idiotic points of view. And again, I don't mean just points of view I don't agree with. I mean objective idiocy.
Like the flat Earth movement, for example.
Yeah, or anti-vaxxers, or things that are making these robust comebacks that are based on not just misinformation, but again, blatant stupidity. I maybe I underestimated all my life how big a factor that was, just kind of waiting to be exploited, or looked at it another way, I overestimated the power of the smart, of, again, looking at recent events in the United States, I when Trump was kind of rising as a candidate, I sort of thought that, I don't know, not the deep state, but that smart people who have gone to college, who are able to have an intelligent conversation. I don't mean intellectuals per se. I just mean just people who have read a book in their life. Would sort of like, okay, enough's enough. This joke has gone on far too long.
Or just everyone, the smart part of every person would say, no.
Yeah. Or or even just an intuitive bullshit detector that there would be a sort of a recognition of, oh, now that I've actually had a good look at this guy, he is so plainly disingenuous. He's so blatantly lying
and self-serving. I think.
Yeah.
That's the thing that strikes me, is that when we talk about Donald Trump, is he's blatantly self-serving and he's open about it. Like, this is for me. This has always been for me, and I will throw the country under the bus to serve me. And I think it's not that people have ignored that, it's that they've accepted that. That's okay. Yeah, I'm out for me too. I want a president who's out for himself, because that's what we're doing, aren't we? And I think when you talk about the deployment of the stupid, it's a great way to phrase it, because I think part of the problem is that stupid is partly aware that it is stupid and okay with that. You
Do you
right?
think it's that? Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm not sure. I haven't gone that far in my thinking whether it is that, whether it's like stupid knows it's stupid, and and the stupid sort of feel, hey, it's nice to be recognized. It's nice,
Right.
or is the con, uh, 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 yeah, is it the stupid feeling empowered in their stupidity? That may be it. That it's sort of, hey, this isn't something you need to correct. It's not something you need to feel shamed about. It's not something that you need to kind of.
Yeah.
It's a political position.
In
I
fact,
guess,
if you do correct it, you're no longer part of the group that you wish to be a part of. Like
right.
if you do go to college, you're no longer a non-college graduate in that block of the demographics, right? Who are very proud of not going to college in many respects. Like if you look at the United States polling, the number of people who never went to college, didn't graduate high school or whatever, often vote Republican. In Canada, Conservative, whatever. This is not new. But what we've found is that people who say that are now prouder of that idea. It's become an identity rather than do you want to have? It's like I'm just thinking of something not good, right? We now no longer see college versus not college as good versus not good. We now see it as left right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I think that's a very good point, and I think that's part of the reason why we see such incoherence within, let's say, the current version of the Republican Party in the United States. Things that don't make sense, or points of view that are like, well, no, you just contradicted yourself. I mean, it's a mess looked at ideologically, and I think it's largely beyond ideology now, where it's even beyond the political. We're into it's just the stupids. So you can throw out any kind of comment, and it doesn't have to stand up in a coherent way with the previous comment. It just simply has to kind of be throwing sort of steak into that same enclosure, and to be sort of devoured hungrily. It's so long as it's recognized as, well, this is for you. This is a comment for you.
Yeah.
And
I'm on your side.
I'm on your side. I don't need to make sense. You don't need to make sense. So we kind of use terms like just use common sense, which is another way of saying incoherence. Yeah, I think that is we are moving, beyond politics, and not in the way that a lot of people think. I don't think it's that beyond. Oh, you mean like sort of a fractured society as a result of social media? It's like, yeah, but no, that's just the symptom of it. I think the larger thing, that's the sort of the elephant in the room, is the division is no longer left or right, woke or unwoke. It's the smart and the stupid.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at it, because it opens up so many other possibilities for interrogating it, right? Because if I'm okay, we ask why Trump happened, why Brexit in the United Kingdom, why social media, why is this scandal occurring, whatever, impeachment, doesn't matter. But the deeper question, why is it that someone can be so completely corrupt blatantly? And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. Why, as you just said, why can someone lie blatantly and then 5 minutes later say the exact opposite thing and continue to maintain their support and continue to have people who want them to continue? Why is that happening? And that's an important question. Is the answer, why is that happening, because I'm okay, because I'm not capable of parsing that out? I'm literally not capable, and there's more and more of me, and my identity group is more and more powerful? Or do I not care? Or am I not paying enough attention? And I think that third point is something we forget. Those of us who do pay attention forget that a lot of people don't care and aren't paying attention. They don't read the newspaper. They're not looking at the news. And the news that they do get is stuff they're seeing a clip of when they're scrolling through. So it's almost a subconscious entering into their understanding of the world. And they don't want to know. And I'm not saying now these people are bad and they shouldn't have the right to participate or something. I'm just saying we have to reckon with the fact that a lot of people don't care and aren't interested. And for those of us who are, we're almost privileging our own position in thinking that, well, surely you'd be interested too. It's that, like you said before, that surely smart wins. Surely everyone who's stupid wants to be smart. And that may not be the case, especially when they become partisan groupings and not just something we can describe and label.
Mm-hmm. No, I know, and it's important to. I feel it's important to note, and I'm not saying that you know that you share this assumption, but the assumption by the smart and the stupids, I don't mean. Although it can align with this, it's not a matter of educated in some formal sense and uneducated. It is. I think it's more about interest, as you say, rightly. It's taking an interest, and it's asking questions and seeking out legitimate, sources that might provide answers to those questions. And I think even more importantly, it's some kind of positionality, a standing outside. It's a resistance, not necessarily to a particular political point of view. It can be that, but a standing outside of kind of all things once they start to institutionalize. So again, we have now a contingency in the United States, which is kind of has been activated, the deployment of the stupid, that we should feel suspicious about any kind of, I feel suspicious about when any kind of argument starts to kind of calcify around me. And it becomes this kind of a school, an institution, a political party. It just gives me the hives. And I think the hives come not from sort of like, Andrew, you're not a team player. That's your problem. I don't think it's that. I think it's, I think that's where you sort of like, no, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm losing the capacity to, question myself in my affiliation with this thing. So that I think there's always been enough people who have stood outside. Now they've voted with a group on particular moments and at elections, and they've joined. It's not that they're living in a cabin in the woods, but that they stand outside in an intellectual sense, in a positionality. I think that's what we're losing with, and we're seeing it in social media. That kind of it's increasingly hard to be outside. Where is outside now? Where is that space?
We're talking again about that identity quilt, right? And it's so interesting because I would like to be able to see an issue as an issue. For example, abortion, to pick one out of the hat, which is not controversial at all, or doesn't stir feelings, or is a moral issue. But it's an issue. It's something we have to figure out. It's something we have to grapple with. It's something we have to talk about. But if that issue becomes an identity feature, then it's no longer an issue that we're arguing about. It's now something that everything else orbits around. Not just my other beliefs, but what kind of refrigerator I'm going to buy. Everything else would necessarily orbit around my identity. And if that's the main piece of the patchwork on my identity, then it's no longer something that we can talk about, which is why we can't talk about some things. It's just why there's no movement on it, whether it's gun control in the United States or Brexit in the United Kingdom is going to be like this for a long time, even though it's over. It's now going to be that dividing nature of that society because of how it's separated people. And if it's no longer just a debate where I can be persuaded, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe I'm not aware of all the facts. Maybe my values aren't aligned with what I believe. But if it's an identity, if it's something I carry with myself, then it's not just moral, but it's also how I have to be represented to the world. And that's scary. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of encouragement to do what you just said, which is to step outside of it for a second. Because
have you ever had the feeling, and I know I have, of let's say you're on social media platform of one kind or another, and you see that something that many of the people that you would sort of follow or correspond with or like-minded with, friends, associates, are expressing an agreement on a particular issue, or they're expressing a position on a particular moment.
Okay.
And you sort of, okay, you might even agree with them, right? So it's not a matter of like, oh, I disagree, but I can't say that because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't even mean, that's a different thing. I'm just talking about, yeah, I agree, but I don't feel obliged in this particular moment to kind of express publicly or in this forum my agreement. But it's there, right? I have felt at times like, am I obliged,
right,
to jump in here?
Yeah, because if you don't, then it's assumed you don't believe what they believe.
Well, that's the risk, right? Could my silence be assumed to be a position in an antagonistic position to what's sort of this body of agreement?
I think absolutely. I certainly feel that pressure in social media. I don't like it, and it's part of why I don't like anything. I try not to ever press that button because as soon as I do, it advertises that I'm on. and that if I liked this, well, why didn't you like this pretty picture of my wedding or something? My wife has a Facebook profile but doesn't use it anymore. Part of the reason is because she felt that she was being a bad friend because people would reach out to her and she'd never respond because it's overwhelming. And so she just has a post on there saying, I don't use Facebook. Email me if you want to. And she didn't delete it because there's a lot of people. She doesn't want to go through 500 people and, okay, what's your email address, whatever. But there is this obligation that she's freed from by putting that out there and not using it. But I post, when this is over, I'm going to make a post that we did this conversation. And now people know that I'm using Facebook. Well, I try not to scroll, but the problem is that, I do sometimes see something and I don't want that obligation. And I don't, it irks me. It makes me uncomfortable. Not because I don't agree with things, but I don't want to have to declare my stance on everything because 90% of the time I don't know and I don't want to know. Not that I don't want to know. I don't have the information to make up my mind on what this person said today. It's either unimportant or it's pigeonholing me. It's making me small to constantly doing that binary, that like-unlike thing we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
And it shapes too. If it were simply a matter of feeling a pressure issue by issue to adhere to a particular sort of take on it, that'd be one thing. It's also the priority that's been assigned to those issues. So today, in this hour that we are enjoying together, that we're not looking at our phones, we don't know. But right now, I can guarantee you that there has been an agenda set for this day.
Yeah.
Within my social, according to the decisions that I've made on social media,
totally,
it has been decided that these are the three things that, Andrew, you should feel very strongly about. And if I actually don't really care about this Star Wars debate, or what it could be pop cultural, where people again feels like I just can't match. I can match it on the politics or I can match it on things that I regard anyways of substance. When, for example, when I see the rise of authoritarianism in formerly great democracies, that upsets me because it harms people, and that makes me very angry. And I don't like it when vulnerable people are subjected to cruelties. And so that happens to I regard that as a high priority. And yet, it doesn't seem to be the case that would necessarily raise issues of that kind to high priority. It doesn't really matter what's there. It's just there's at a given hour, those three rotating things. It could be sort of like how some director, screwed up on the last Star Wars installment. Right. But the same level of passion is applied to each of those issues. You need to weigh in.
And we're confusing passion with priority.
Right. There's no priority at all. I'm trying to sort of teach my children who are 13 and 10 about how to, apply priority to their lives. What's really important to you. And it might be, it's not what's important to me, but that's hard, right? Like that's what being an adult essentially is organizing your life according to priorities. For me, it would be, be my family and their safety and loving them and having them know that I love them and etc. So that is my priority, and it's not sort of waging some kind of online war about how I really hated the latest Star Wars movie. Like that seems bizarre to me. But I think one of the results of this, again, kind of social media, virtual life, is that all those things are kind of equal. They're kind of it doesn't really matter what the topic is, so long as you engage in it now.
Right. So your patchwork quilt of identity again is a series of you are a composition of the aggregate of all the likes and dislikes you ever made on social media, for example. But if they're all equal, then all of the patches are equal size. There's no single thing. And in fact, there's so many things you've had to decide on that it's impossible to say who you are anymore. It's the adage of if you like everything, you like nothing. If you try to do everything, then you do nothing. We're only capable of doing so much in a finite period of time with scarce resources. And so identity and our attention to our identity, I think, works in the same way. And it's a scary thought that I'm being held to the standard, whether I like it or not, and if I give into it, then I'm just nothing. Like I'm pulled in so many different directions. And the other thing too is, sure, I can make up my mind about the latest Star Wars installment and say, yeah, that movie sucked. But if it's not important, then I can make room for that in my mind, and I can also be persuaded too. If it's extremely important, then I'll never. Then again, it becomes so core to me that I can never like anyone who thinks it was a great film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think yes, and I think that will increasingly become important to the survival of self. And by that I mean resistance. Resistance, not necessarily just in the sort of Democrats versus Republican sense, although that's a big part of it. And it's not just resistance in the sense of individual against the corporate, it's resistance in kind of in all arenas. I think we must, to preserve the idea of a self, that the action that defines the self, however we land on a particular decision or choice, is almost immaterial. It's the resistance to unanimity, to affiliation, to obligation. It's in the act of resistance that the self might be preserved. If we give up on that, if it just becomes a matter of taste choices, then the self dies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And very true. I think one of the issues with so-called direct democracy is that if we all had to decide on everything, we would not only not have the energy and the mental space to do that, but we would also no longer be individual units. We'd all be marched along and making every little tiny decision. There's something to be said about not just authority, delegating authority, but delegating work. Delegating, I don't want to think about this right now. I want to write my novel. I don't want to spend 3 days working on my car because my transmission isn't working. I want a mechanic to do that in 2 hours. It's basic economic division of labor. But there's also a division of mental space that needs to happen in our world too. Otherwise, we lose what makes us unique. Yeah. And what makes us passionate and what makes us want to be alive and have conversations like this. Andrew, last question for you to wrap us up. If there was one thing that we haven't talked about that you wish we had, that you could dig into for another hour if we had to, what would that one thing be?
Oh, man. I mean...
Nothing. We've covered everything.
Oh no, no. Well, there's so many things. I mean, it's an enjoyable conversation we've had. Largely thanks to you and your. I've certainly enjoyed this, right? And partly, it's also because I don't get out much, So I work at home, and I'm actually quite a social person. But over the years, parenting. It's the old joke. I live in Toronto, and it's like, you can have friends who... I literally see my friend who lives in Copenhagen more often than my friend who lives on the Danforth, 5 subway stops away.
Right.
So, sad joke. But, so I could talk about a whole bunch of things, the prospects of the Maple Leafs going into the playoffs, right through to writing and publishing and recent kind of manifestations or concerns or anxieties in that field. But no, I mean, I think I think the thing we've already talked about it, but I think my prevailing kind of anxiety going forward for my kids would be, in addition to the sort of the practical matters of climate change and those very worrying things, would be sort of finding a space that isn't programmed, and that And that's what, we're already repeating in a way what we've already said. But I do feel like that's where, for me, kind of all the roads are leading back to in a way now.
Yeah, but we haven't said that. That's a really interesting way to phrase it. Finding a space that isn't programmed, which is harder and harder to do in a city, let alone this digital programmed space, which can give us the illusion that it is free and open and not programmed and you can be whoever you want. But there's a difference, for me, for example, there's a difference between writing on a scrap of paper and typing into a Word document. Both are programmed in a way. Both are learned behaviors, and it's a piece of paper, not the whole world as a canvas. But there's something more freeing because it's less programmed about writing on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. I can I can rip the page if I want to. I can break my computer, but that's a fundamentally different thing. To put my fist through the computer monitor, not that I've ever done that, but and the search for something. I think that's why we play a lot more board games. Culturally today, is because we're trying to get away from that programmed space. It's not that board games aren't programmed again, but they're a different kind. They're more, we can pause it for a second and have an analog discussion. Whereas we're streamlined in when we're in the Matrix, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the horror movie aspect of a version of this, of course, is that I've already mentioned Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but thinking about that, we assume that the invasion will be some kind of alien force
Right.
that sort of very that takes us over, and we go very involuntarily. It's by force that they take us over. And I don't think any of the those horror scenarios really anticipated how voluntary it will actually end up being. It'll be, and the people who stand outside of it, the resistors, the survivors, the heroes, will be just kind of lonely people, kind of looking around, sort of wondering, like, is anyone else like me?
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who's kind of chosen not to go into the mouth of the monster? Because everyone else is. They're just kind of like delightedly, submitting to this thing.
Yeah.
And we know it, right? There's headlines every day saying, like, hey, by the way, your phone is watching you. By the way, it's actually making you depressed.
Totally.
By the way, do you feel miserable and impotent? Like, yes. Well, that's because of the decisions you're making. I'm going to continue to make those choices. Like, all of us are knowingly, willingly doing stuff that makes us miserable.
Well, yeah, I mentioned this on the podcast before, but do you remember when Edward Snowden, that whole thing came out? And for the first week or two, it was like, oh my God, governments are going to fall over this. This is crazy. This has never happened since the Cold War. And even then, this is a whole other level because it's so dominant in our lives. 2 weeks later, I guess we all just are spied on now. It's just accepted. The paradigm has shifted. We use our phones just as much as we did before. And I guess governments are changing some of the legislation, but I don't really care because my phone is my phone, whatever. And that in retrospect is horrifying because it's not just voluntary, it's also a shrug of the shoulders. Even if it was involuntary, I don't care enough to resist. Count me in. Sign me up. If I'm not paying, I guess I'm the product. Whatever. The benefit is too high for me. The benefit being, I guess, the dopamine addiction I get when I'm on my phone or whatever it is that I'm getting from it. But it's
or it may be a sort of a question of like, well, what is this outside you're even talking about? Like, I can't even imagine what that space is.
Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a really cool conversation.
Thank you.
To learn more about Andrew Pyper, go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find links to other episodes as well as a way to get in touch with me on social media or by email. Let me know what you think of this episode, about any other, and what questions, what ideas, what thoughts it springs forth for you. At the website, you can also get the notes for this episode to find the things that maybe were referenced and that you wanted to find out more about. Now, your quote of the week is from Andrew's book, The Demonologist. It goes, "Sometimes people close a door because they're trying to figure out a way to get you to knock." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for the wonderful music, and special thanks for this episode to Andrew Pyper for allowing us to record in his wonderful home in Toronto, Ontario. Next up, we're talking with another Torontonian, Aurora Brown, who you might know from the Baroness Von Sketch Show. We talk about acting, creativity, and comedy. I'll see you then.